Hi, today we're going to go over the build of an Eggfinder TX GPS tracker board. This is the full-size tracker from Eggtimer. We did a mini build earlier. This is kind of the big brother. The benefits of the larger board is you get a little bit more range because of the larger antenna plane and antenna options. And you can also use an Open Datalogger with this kit, which you can't with the mini. So this is my setup. If you've seen some of my other videos, I changed it recently. I got an Hakko FX972. I use my own Kester soldering wire, but you should use the wire that comes with the kit. It's really excellent Kester stuff as well. And I use a variety of vices, clamps, holds, downs while I'm working to help me out. And I do recommend having some kind of vent fan or fume extractor. I use a Hakko FA400. So here's the package as it comes from Eggfinder. The first step we're going to do is open everything up, lay it all out, and do a good solid inventory. You want to make sure you inventory all the parts before you start the build. Two reasons. One, obviously, you want to make sure you've got all the parts. Although I've never had a chance where Eggfinder didn't provide all the parts, but you do want to make sure you've got them. And two, to familiarize yourself with all of the parts before you start. So go ahead and cut open the bags, get everything out of that anti-static bag, lay it out on your table, and we're going to actually go through the checklist and actually mark it off with a pencil as we go, so you have all the parts. So the first thing up is the PCB itself with the GPS unit already soldered on. So this is what that looks like. Next up, go ahead and mark off as you go. Next up is the RF module. Pretty distinctive. Shouldn't really mess this one up too much. This one's pretty easy. It's another PCB. Put that to the side, mark it off. And then next up, we've got the voltage regulator, a very distinctive voltage regulator you see in most of these builds from Eggtimer. 3 pins on one side and one very large pin on another. Next up, you've got a rectifier. Now this one's a little odd. You don't see this one too many times in a lot of these builds. So that one's got 4 pins around it. This is a LED light that you're going to install. You've got some 330 ohm resistors. These are the only resistors we've got on this build. And then you've got some capacitors. You see the 0.1 UF capacitors, and this is what's called a white paper carrier. So when you see this, these are easy to mess up, the capacitors between them. Make sure you're using the correct ones. Those are the 0.1 UF in the white paper carrier. These are the 10 UF in the plastic carrier. So they look very, very similar. Just make sure when we get to those ports of the build, you use the right one. You've got a 8-pin header here. You're gonna split up into different sections on the board. You got some shorting jumpers here for the run and program spots on the board, and then you've got some. So it comes with a brass antenna and some heat shrink tubing, and we'll go through that. But we're actually not going to use that in the build. I will demonstrate how it goes on, but we're going to use a different antenna. You've got a jumper cable here for if you need to program it. You've got some of the soldering wire that comes with the kit. I highly recommend using that if you don't have your own high quality soldering wire. And then one of the things that's not in the kit that I'm adding on here is an RP-SMA connector that we will be using for the antenna. So if you're going to use an external antenna or you want to use a higher gain antenna, you need to have one of these connectors. You can get one from Eggtimer. Here's the setup I'm going to use for this one. A couple of tweezers, flat tweezers, and the pointy tweezers is always useful in these builds. So make sure you've got your equipment all set up and ready to go. And then mount your board in however you're going to do it. We're doing the Rev D3 version of this board. It's the most recent as of the time of the build. So the first thing up is these 0.1 UF capacitors. And remember, again, the white paper carrier. Make sure you get them in the right ones here. It is pretty critical because it won't work if you mix them up. But they go into those sections, those 2 spots there called C104. So you just tin one of the pads. In this case, we're just going to tin both the pads to tack on the chips themselves. and then reheat up that solder and use your tweezers to slide the component, the capacitor, right into place so it's evenly spaced on the metal pads, and do that for both of them. You can do these one at a time, it's fine. And then go back after that and give it a nice little solder tent, little bubble on each side. Make sure that it seats down just slightly under the chip onto the pad and goes up just over it. You don't want too much. You don't want to bridge the pads underneath, but you just want to have it just under the chip a little bit and it's firmly seated to the metal pad with a little bit of solder on top. Once you get those capacitors in, we're going to do the 10 UF now. These are the plastic carriers. We're going to put one in right now, and you can see it's right next to those two that we just put in. So we're not going to, this is only one right now. There's 3 of these total, but we want to put this one in, and then we don't want to put the other ones in until we put that voltage regulator in, because that voltage, it would be tough to get that voltage regulator in with the 10 UF capacitors in the way. So same technique here, just tack it on one side and then solder it in securely. After this, we're probably going to start speeding up the video on these so you don't have to keep watching surface-mounted chips go on. Now, you can see here, it's getting a little cold solder, right? If that happens, just heat it back up, and you see I knocked the chip off. I kept this in specifically because sometimes I mess it up too. And you can see when I try to get it off here, it flips right off the board. Luckily, it went on my pad. I cleaned up the board with some soldering wick and retacked it on, and this was the proper way to stick it on. Now, I'm still getting a little bit of cold solder there. Just make sure that you have a good solder joint there, and it's shiny and it's not dull before you leave this chip in place. All right, so next up, we're going to have that voltage regulator. Now, a lot of these, you need to wait 30 seconds between the soldering. It goes to that large spot there above the capacitors that we just put in. So I like to tin that large pad, slide it into place, make sure that the large pin is centered into the big pad, and the other 3 pins, the small pins, are nicely centered on the small pads. You can kind of hold it down with your tweezers while it cools, and then you start soldering each one of these pins in. Now, I cut the video out, okay? You do need to wait 30 seconds minimum between each one of these pins, but I don't want you to have to watch it on a video waiting. But I did wait 30 seconds, so make sure you're waiting 30 seconds between each one of these small pins. Now, for these, you want to make sure you get a nice clean joint, nice and shiny. That one was a little bit of cold solder, so I re-tinned it a little bit, and then it gets up underneath the pin and on the pad, so you get a nice connection. Should be a nice tent over that. Finally, once you've done all the small pins, go back and solder a good chunk of solder onto that large pin. It actually acts as a heat sink as well as giving it a good connection. Next up is this rectifier. Now, make sure you pay attention here. It's got a positive and a negative terminal on the 2 of the pins, and those have a specific orientation on the board. So you make sure you line it up correctly. You can see here the positive and the negative signs on the board. Make sure it's oriented properly or it won't work. So once you've got, once you have your orientation correct, tin one of the pads, and then just like the other components, slide it into place. Make sure it's nice and centered on all 4 pads, and then we'll go in and solder the pads. Now, note that it's a little thin. It doesn't sit in the middle of the pads. The pins kind of sit on the edge of the pad a little bit, so just get it nice and square. Once it's in, though, go ahead and solder each pin on just like we did with the voltage regulator. Now, again, waiting 30 seconds or more between each of these pins. I'm not putting that in the video, so you don't have to sit here and watch me wait for 30 seconds, but you should wait 30 seconds so that you don't overheat the chip while you're doing this. Okay, and then resolder that last pin to make sure it's all nice and secure, and then we're going to move on. All right, next up, we've got some more of these 10 UF capacitors. They go on the side of the board by the voltage regulator and at the end of the board by the voltage regulator. Exactly the same as the other ones. We will speed up the video here a little bit so that you don't have to sit here and keep watching the same techniques over and over again in slow motion. But This is sped up 3x. Take your time, get it right, tack the chip on, solder it securely before you move on. All right, with those 10 UF capacitors in place, we've got one more surface mount here. This is the 330 ohm resistor. It's right over by the side of the GPS unit there. We'll do this in real time since it's the only resistor you got to do, but it's the same as the capacitors. You just tin a pad, center the chip into the pads, and then solder it on securely. Now, next thing up is this LED light. Now notice one of the pins is longer. That longer pin goes on the positive side where the plus is. So you see it's just slightly longer. That goes into that side where the plus is. All you got to do is drop it in the hole. Make sure the polarity is correct. And tape it on. Just use a little bit of masking tape. Don't use electrical tape or duct tape here. It gets gum on the board. Just use regular old masking tape. On the other side, these are easy through-hole soldering joints. Just make sure you get a nice little tent of solder and it goes down into that hole and solders that light on securely. And then you're going to trim those pins off because they're very long. Make sure when you trim these pins, you secure the end a little bit with some tweezers or pliers, whatever, because they have a tendency to fly off. They can be a safety hazard. So make sure you secure those securely. Now, we're going to start putting on some of these header strips here. You're going to have to cut them up. I just use wire cutters. In this case, the first one you're going to need is a 3-pin one for the LCD connection. The short end goes into the board on the top, okay, and that goes through the board. Tape them on, and then it's just like any other through hole. Just get a nice little tent of solder on each pin, and your first header is on the board. Next up, you need to cut a 2-pin header off to put into the run position. So once again, same thing, put the short pins through the board from the top, tape it down, and then turn the board over and solder those pins in securely. All right, at this point, we need to test the board to make sure we've done everything right up till now. So I'm going to use a JST connector here because I'm going to be using 2S LiPos on this board. So just make sure you put the battery in the proper orientation. I use with polarity. I use a pair of helping hands there. Just put the wire through. You can see this is with the positive wire. Then solder that on securely, and then put the negative wire through. Same again. Use your helping hands. Hold that in place and solder that wire on. Once we've got this soldered on, we're going to go test it on the computer. So you're going to need to open up a terminal program. Like I use Putty, but basically you're just going to hook up your serial cable to the program. To the LCD connector, the white and the black wire. To the proper connectors, connect your battery. Now, if you're using Windows, you need to know which COM port you're using. Go to the Windows Manager there. You can see I'm using COM port 3. This is my Putty session. Use serial. I'm changing it to COM 3 because that's what my serial connection's on. Everything else pretty much stays the same. Putty, it's a 9600 baud. And then if you did it right, if the build's going correctly, you should see this on your Putty screen. Or your terminal screen, and this indicates that you've done everything correctly up to this point. So with that done, we now can go move on to the RF module. So line up that RF module so all of those brass pins or sections are lined up with the pads properly, then tape it in place securely. And then you want to make sure you use the tape covers all of the small components on the board so that if you have any spalling or solder that gets up on the board, it doesn't ruin your board. So on both sides, make sure you've securely taped it and covered all those components. Now, this is another one of those parts where you need to wait 30 seconds between each pin. So once you're ready and everything's taped and lined up, heat up one of those sockets and the pad and put a nice tent of solder in there. You don't want it so much that it goes up into that hole on top or bridges anything underneath, or or kind of moves to another pad. What you're seeing right there is about the right amount of solder, just enough to go over the top and provide a nice tent. Now, I am waiting 30 seconds between each one of these, and we're speeding up the video here because you don't want to sit here and watch this forever. But you have to wait 30 seconds between here so you don't ruin the RF module with heat. Now, on this side, we're only going to do that one pin next to the antenna pin for right now. And then I'll show you how to put the brass antenna on, even though we're not going to use it. So you want to sand or emery cloth or file, or just basically clean off the oxidation on one end. Give an inch or so. The part where you're going to solder it on, you want that oxidation on the metal cleaned off, so you see that shiny part there. And then measure it out about 1/8 of an inch. Mark it, and then we're going to bend it in a 90-degree angle. So that it can fit in the, it's a lot easier to bend it. So in this, it's a little long, but this makes it easier to bend the antenna. So once you've marked it out, I just use a pair of pliers and then bend it 90 degrees. At that point, you're going to measure half that distance on the bent portion, about a 1/16 of an inch, and clip that off so that it'll fit perfectly in the board. But you can see here, just mark that off, take a pair of wire cutters, and clip it. Now, I am not going to install this antenna. This is just demonstrating what you would do if you were going to use the wire antenna. And this is where I'm going to stop now. You would put this in that hole, line it up on the pad, and then solder along the wire in that whole pad, and you would bridge that socket in the pad on the other side. We're not going to do that. I'm just demonstrating it here. We're going to move on and take this off and install an RP-SMA connector. The 3 pins go on top and the 2 pins go on the bottom. So at this point, you just line it up just like that. I taped it on the other side to hold it in place. And then you're just going to start soldering all of those pins. Now, they're pretty big pins. If you have a slightly larger gauge soldering wire, that it works really well here, because this is a much larger than those other components. Or you can use the same exact solder. It works just fine. But basically, you're going to tack one of the pins on really quick. While it's hot, I'm going to push it on a little bit because it tends to want to lean down. And now that it's cool, I'm going to go and solder those other pins on. Get a really decent chunk of solder here. One, you want a good connection, but also, you're going to have an antenna hanging off this thing. You want to make sure you have a really solid connection soldering it to the board. Once you have the side one done, you're going to do that middle one. Now, the middle one, you're not only connecting that round pin to the pad, but you also want to make sure you solder it all the way to the socket there in the pad on the RF module that we did not solder earlier. Then go back, and that first pin, I don't feel like that was enough solder. I like to get a little bit over on top of it. There we go. And then flip the board over and do the same thing with those 2 pins on the back. All right. Once you get both these pins soldered on, apologies for the blurry video here. It focused on the wire while I was soldering this time. It can happen on these with the fixed camera positions. Once you're happy with the soldering on these pins with the RP-SMA connector, you can take all that tape off. Now we've got a couple more jumpers to put in. Header strips. You need to cut off another two pin header. That goes into the program PGM spot, so that you can program it later if you need to change the frequency. So tape that in place just like the other ones, and then solder those pins on the bottom. All right, with the program header in place, it's pretty much done. We're going to move into a testing mode now before we do anything with the Openlog Datalogger, which we will put on in this build. So this is what it looks like when it's done. And then I'm going to take it outside and test it with an LCD receiver so that I can't get satellites inside. So first thing we're going to do is connect it inside and make sure that the light on the RF module lights up. Great. We know that it's the first indicator that it's working. The next thing we're going to do is, as I noted, hook it up to a LCD receiver. Now, I'm not going to go through that process. We can work through that in another video, or you can work through it. But you can see here, it's getting satellites, it's getting a position, so everything's good. So the last thing we're going to do is install the Open Datalogger. It comes in a pouch with a header pin set, a 6-pin header, and the Open Datalogger itself, which takes an SD card. So that's the logger, the PCB that's going to go on top of the board. What we need to do is install the 6-pin header into those where it says Openlog on the board. The short side pins go in through the board again. So just put that in, tape it down, and then turn it over. In this case, I'm just taping the middle pins to keep it in place, and then I'm going to solder the end pins securely, and then remove the tape and solder the middle pins. All right, we'll speed that up a little bit. Now, once we turn this over, you'll see you put the Open Datalogger chip with the SD card side up and facing away from the edge. Those holes go right over the pins that you just installed, just like that. Now, you can't solder it like this. It's sitting right on the RF module. You need to separate that a little bit, and you need to give it a spacer. I just used a folded over piece of 3x5 card. This is just cardstock that I folded over once. Gives you, in my opinion, it gives you a nice, just about the right distance, the right separation between the RF module and the Openlogger chip. I taped it down so it's nice and flat, and then all you got to do is go solder each one of those pins, and you can see here that spacing that I'm talking about, right? So once you're good with that, go ahead and solder each one of these pins on. We'll speed up the video here a little bit. So it's just yet another through-hole pin soldering technique. Okay, once that's soldered on, you can take the spacer out and we'll take a look at that spacing again without the card in there. But you can see it's not touching the RF module. It's resting just a bit above it. Then just go through and trim those pins down a little bit. But make sure you're, again, doing good pin management here and not letting those things just fly all over the place, since they are a hazard. Get in your eye or get onto the board itself and short something out. So once you've got all that done, we're going to test this out real quick. I have a micro SD card laying around. You throw the card into the reader and then hook up your battery. And if you've installed everything correct, the light on the Openlogger should be lighting up underneath there. You can see that. So this is all good. We've connected to the LCD. We've connected to the Openlogger. All the lights are working properly. This was a good build. This is it. This is where it should look like when you're complete. Hopefully, if you have any questions, you can put them down in the video. This is not a particularly hard build. It is slightly larger than the Mini, but I love this one. It is a great one. If you're going over 30,000 feet, this is a great tracker. It works very, very well, and it doesn't have a huge amount of battery requirements. So good luck with your build. Throw any questions down in the comments, and have a great day.